Okay, this is going to be another installment of The History of Tammany Hall by Gustavus Myers from over a century ago. Of course, this is rejected knowledge. This book was rejected. It's why it's so hard to find nowadays. So few people know about it. We're going to start here with Chapter 25, Collapse and Dispersion of the Ring, 1871 to 1872. The downfall of the Ring was inevitable. No such stupendous series of frauds could reasonably be expected to continue once the proper machinery for their exposure and for the awakening of the dormant public conscience was put in motion. Protests and complaints and even concerted opposition might for the time prove futile, as indeed they did. But the wind had been sown for the reaping of the whirlwind, and it could not be averted. One conspicuous instance of apparently futile criticism of the Ring was the action of the New York City Council of Political Reform. This body, but recently organized, held a mass meeting in Cooper Union, April 6, 1871, to consider, quote, the alarming aspects of public affairs generally, unquote, and to agree upon means for arousing the public to some remedial action. Speeches were made by Henry Ward Beecher, Judge George Barrett, William Havemeyer, William Walter Phelps, and William Evarts. It was pointed out that the city debt had increased from about $86 million in 1868 to over $186 million at the close of 1870. But, amazing as were the facts, the meeting produced no direct effect. The immediate causes of the exposure were fortuitous and accidental. In December 1870, Watson, who had become one of the chiefs in the finance department, was fatally injured while sleigh riding and died a week later. In the resultant change, Stephen C. Lyons, Jr. succeeded Watson, and Matthew J. O'Rourke succeeded Lyons as county bookkeeper. Mr. O'Rourke gradually came upon the evidence of the enormous robberies. In the meantime, some of the evidence had also come into the possession of James O'Brien, one of the Young Democracy leaders. Comptroller Connolly was on the point of paying out the $5 million called for by the Viaduct Railroad Act, as well as other sums, but learning of O'Brien's knowledge of the situation, resolved to defer the payments. In the summer of 1871, Mr. O'Rourke presented his evidence to the New York Times. This newspaper published the figures in detail, producing fresh disclosures day after day, and showing indisputably that the city had been plundered on a stupendous scale. In 2 instances alone, in the printing bills and the bills for the erection and repairing of the county courthouse, the Times averred that over $10 million had been illegally squandered. Tweed had bought an obscure sheet, the Transcript, and had made it the official organ for city and county advertising. He had also formed the New York Printing Company, which not only did the city printing, but claimed the custom of many persons and corporations whom he was in a position either to aid or injure. These 2 properties served as the highly useful media with which to extort millions from the city treasury. The Times gave the incontestable figures, disclosing that the sum of nearly $3 million was squandered for county printing, stationery, and advertising during the years 1869, 1870, and 1871. But the new county courthouse, the Times demonstrated, was the chief means of directly robbing the city. All told, so far as could be learned, the sum of $8,500,000 had been spent for quote-unquote repairs in 31 months. Enough, the Times said, to have built and furnished 5 new buildings, such as the county courthouse. Merely the furnishing, repairing, and decorating of this building, it was shown, cost $7 million. One firm alone, Ingersoll and Company, received in 2 years the gigantic sum of $5,600,000, quote, for supplying the county courthouse with furniture and carpets, unquote. In brief, the county courthouse, it was set forth specifically, instead of costing between $3 million and $5 million, as the Ring all along had led the public to believe, had actually cost over $12 million, the bulk of which was stolen. The members of the Ring affected an air of unconcern regarding the disclosures. When Tweed was questioned as to the charges, he made his famous reply, quote, "What are you going to do about it?" unquote. He professed not to care for newspaper attacks, yet Thomas Nast's terribly effective cartoons pierced him to the heart. He lamented, quote, "If those picture papers would only leave me alone, I wouldn't care for all the rest. The people get used to seeing me in stripes, and by grow to think I ought to be in prison," unquote. Mayor Hall put on an air of jocose indifference, occasionally replying to the charges by references to the alleged frauds in the federal government, but oftener by wondrously facetious jests such as, quote, "Counts at Newport are at a discount," unquote. Quote, "Shocking levity. The lightship off Savannah has gone astray," unquote. Quote, "These warm yet occasionally breezy days, with charmingly cool mornings and evenings, are an indication that we are likely to have what befell Adam, an early fall," unquote. The public, however, was at last aroused, and the impudent flippancy of Tweed, Hall, and others only added to the public indignation. Though the Times was but imperfectly armed with proofs, each day's revelations brought the citizens to a keener realization of the unprecedented enormity of the thefts, and the resolve was made by leading members of both parties in the city to unite and crush the Ring. A call for a mass meeting to be held in Cooper Union, September 4th, was met by a tremendous outpouring of citizens. William Havemeyer, the former mayor, presided, and 227 vice presidents and 15 secretaries were chosen from among the foremost names in the community. Among the speakers were Robert B. Roosevelt and Judge Edwards Pierpont. Now, for the first time, the public obtained a really definite idea of the magnitude of the sum stolen by the Ring and its followers. Resolutions were reported by Joseph Choate, stating that the acknowledged, funded, and bonded debt of the city and county was upward of $113 million, over $63 million more than it was when Mayor Hall took office, and that there was reason to believe that there were floating, contingent, or pretended debts and claims against the city and county which would amount to many more millions of dollars, and which would be paid out of the city treasury unless the fiscal officers were removed and their proceedings arrested. The resolutions concluded by directing the appointment of an executive committee of 70 to overthrow the ring, abolish abuses, secure better laws, and by united effort, without reference to party, obtain a good government and honest officers to administer it. The first move decided upon by the Committee of 70 was to make a thorough examination of the city's accounts. A subcommittee was on the point of doing this when, on the morning of September 11th, it was reported that the Comptroller's office in the City Hall had been broken into on the previous night, and the vouchers, more than 8,500 in all, stolen. The Ring Confederates pretended that the vouchers had been abstracted from a glass case, an absurd explanation considering that, after spending $400,000 for safes, the city officials should have chosen such a flimsy receptacle. Later, the charred remains of these vouchers were discovered in an ash heap in the City Hall attic. As if to yield to public opinion, Mayor Hall at once asked Connally to resign as Comptroller. Connally refused, on the ground that such a step without impeachment and conviction on trial would be equal to a confession of guilt. Secretly, however, fearing that the other members of the Ring intended to make a scapegoat of him, he was disposed to make terms with the Committee of 70 to save himself. Upon the advice of Havemeyer, he appointed Andrew Green Deputy Comptroller. With Mr. Green in that post, the Committee of 70 would expect a tangible computation of the Ring's thefts. Alive to their danger, the other members of the Ring, in terror, tried to force Connally to resign, so as to end the powers he had delegated to the new Deputy Comptroller. Mayor Hall insisted that, in making Mr. Green acting Comptroller, Connally's action was equivalent to a resignation, and with much bluster said he would treat it as such. In October, the subcommittee made a hasty examination of such of the city accounts as were available, and were enabled to report that the debt of the city was doubling every 2 years, that $3,200,000 had been paid for repairs on armories and drill rooms, the actual cost of which was less than $250,000, that over $11 million had been charged for outlays on the unfinished county courthouse, the entire cost of building which, on an honest estimate, would be less than $3 million, that safes, carpets, furniture, cabinet work, painting, plumbing, gas, and plastering had cost $7,289,466, the real value of which was found to be only $624,180. that $460,000 had been paid for $48,000 worth of lumber, that the printing, advertising, stationery, etc. of the city and county had cost in 2 years and 8 months $7,168,212, that a large number of persons were on the payrolls of the city whose services were neither rendered nor needed, and that figures upon warrants and vouchers had been altered fraudulently and payments made repeatedly on forged endorsements. These figures, though presenting nothing more than an outline of the immensity of corruption, gave the Committee of 70 a foundation upon which to proceed legally. It at once obtained an injunction from Judge Barnard, restraining for the time the payment of all moneys out of the city treasury. The order was modified subsequently to permit the necessary payments. The city treasury had been sacked so completely that it was found necessary to borrow nearly $1 million from the banks to satisfy the more pressing claims. The Committee of 70 next presented Mayor Hall before the grand jury for indictment. Anticipating this, the Ring had packed the grand jury, but such was the public outcry on this fact becoming known that Judge Barnard was forced to dismiss the jury and order a new panel. The second jury, however, did not indict the mayor, giving as a reason the lack of conclusive evidence. Later, Hall was tried, but the jury disagreed. The Committee of 70 next procured the appointment of Charles O'Connor as assistant to the Attorney General, and then engaged as O'Connor's assistants William M. Evarts, Wheeler H. Peckham, and Judge Emmett, with the express view of driving the Ring men into prison. Through their energy, Tweed was arrested on the affidavit of Samuel J. Tilden on October 26th and held to bail in the sum of $1 million. But Tweed was not yet crushed. In a few days, on November 7th, an election for members of the legislature, state officers, judges of the Supreme Court, and aldermen and assistant aldermen was to be held. Most of the Ring men, in the very face of the revelations of their stupendous thefts, forgery, bribing, and election frauds, came forward as candidates for renomination and election. Once elected, they reckoned upon their vindication. The Committee of 70 naturally aimed at the defeat of the Tammany candidates, both for political and moral effect, and placed candidates in the field for all local, legislative, and judicial offices. As Grand Sachem and chairman of the Tammany General Committee, Tweed was still boss. He arranged to win by his oft-used weapons of bribery and intimidation, if not by violence. The two Republican police commissioners were his hirelings, owing their offices to him. They could be depended upon to aid their Tammany colleagues into making the police a power for his benefit. How well otherwise the Ring was fortified was shown when the Times charged that 69 members of the Republican General Committee, which assumed to direct the councils of the Republican Party in the city were stipendiaries of Tweed and Sweeney. One of them was quoted as saying, quote, "I go up to my headquarters the first of every month and get $100, but I don't hold no office and don't do no work," unquote. Tammany feigned to regard Tweed as a great benefactor being hounded. Tweed carried out the comedy to his best. On September 22nd, a, quote, "great Tweed mass meeting," unquote, assembled in, quote, unquote, Tweed Plaza. Resolutions were vociferously adopted that, quote, "pleased with his past record and having faith in his future, recognizing his ability and proud of his leadership, believing in his integrity and outraged by the assaults upon it, knowing of his steadfastness and commending his courage, admiring his magnanimity and grateful for his philanthropy, the democracy of the 4th Senatorial District of the State of New York, constituents of the Honorable William M. Tweed, in mass meeting assembled, place him in nomination for re-election, and pledge him their earnest, untiring, and enthusiastic support," unquote. Despite the public agitation over the frauds, the Tammany nominations were of the worst possible character. Nominees for the state Senate included such ring men as Genet, Mike Norton, John Bradley, and Walton, and for the Assembly, Jim Hayes, an unscrupulous tool. Tom Fields, reputed to be probably the most corrupt man that ever sat in the legislature. Alexander Freer, who for years had engineered ring bills. And Jimmy Irving, who had been forced to resign his seat in the Assembly the previous winter to avoid being expelled for a personal assault on a fellow member. The innumerable Tammany ward clubs, all bent on securing a share of the quote-unquote swag, paraded and bellowed for these characters. The election proved that the people had really awakened. The victory of the Committee of 70 was sweeping. Of the anti-Tammany candidates, all of the judges, 4 of the 5 senators, 15 of the 21 assemblymen, and all but 2 of the aldermen were elected, and a majority of the assistant aldermen had given pledges for reforms. The one Tammany candidate for senator elected was the boss himself, and he won by over 9,000 majority. The frauds in his district were represented by careful observers as enormous. In many precincts, it was unsafe to vote against him. Opposing voters were beaten and driven away from the polls. The police, the police helping in the assaults. See how easy it is to buy off a whole police force? Been done time and time again in our era. Every time there was a political assassination in whatever city, that police department was summarily, quickly bought off right after that. The re-election of Tweed, good citizens thought, was the crowning disgrace, and measures were soon taken which effectually prevented him from taking his seat. On November 20th, Connolly resigned as controller, and Andrew H. Green was appointed in his place. On November 25th, Connolly was arrested and held in $1 million bail. Unable to furnish it, he was committed to jail. On December 16th, Tweed was indicted for felony, While being taken to the Tombs, he was snatched away on a writ of habeas corpus and haled before Judge Barnard, who released him on the paltry bail of $5,000. Boy, does that ever reek of a Freemasonic handshake deal. A fortnight later, forced by public opinion, Tweed resigned as Commissioner of Public Works, thus giving up his last hold on power. The careers of the Ring men after 1871 form a striking contrast to their former splendor. Tweed ceased to be Grand Sachem. Almost every man's hand seemed raised against him. The newspapers, which had profited most by his thefts, grew rabid in denouncing him and his followers, and urged the fullest punishment for them. He was tried on January 30th, 1873. The jury disagreed. During the next summer he fled to California. Voluntarily returning to New York City, against the advice of his friends, he was tried a second time on criminal indictments on November 19th. Found guilty on 3/4 of the 120 counts, Judge Noah Davis sentenced him to 12 years' imprisonment and to pay a fine of $12,000. Upon being taken to Blackwell's Island, the warden of the penitentiary asked him the usual questions. What occupation? Statesman, Tweed replied. What religion? None. After 1 year's imprisonment, Tweed was released by a decision of the Court of Appeals on January 15th, 1875. That smacks of a Freemasonic secret deal there. On the ground that, owing to a legal technicality, the 1 year was all he was required to serve. Anticipating this decision, Tilden and his associates had secured the passage of an act by the legislature expressly authorizing the people to institute a civil suit such as they could not otherwise maintain. New civil suits were then brought against Tweed, and as soon as he was discharged from the penitentiary, he was rearrested and held in $3 million bail. This bail he could not get, and he lay in prison until December 4th, when, while visiting his home in the custody of 2 keepers, he escaped. For 2 days he hid in New Jersey, and later was taken to a farmhouse near the Palisades. He disguised himself by shaving his beard and clipping his hair, and wearing a wig and gold spectacles. Fleeing again, he spent a while in a fisherman's hut near the Narrows, visiting Brooklyn and assuming the name of John Secor. Leaving on a schooner, he landed on the coast of Florida, whence he went to Cuba in a fishing smack, landing near Santiago de Cuba. The fallen boss and a companion were at once arrested as suspicious characters, the 10 Years' War being then in progress, and Tweed was recognized. He, however, smuggled himself on board the Spanish bark Carmen, which conveyed him to Vigo, Spain. Upon the request of Hamilton Fish, Secretary of State, he was arrested and turned over to the commander of the United States man-of-war Franklin, which brought him back to New York on November 28, 1876. In one of the civil suits, judgment had been given against him for over $6 million. Confessing to this, he was put in jail, to be kept there until he satisfied it, a requirement he said he was unable to meet. The city found no personal property upon which to levy. Tweed testified in 1877 that He held about $2,500,000 worth of real estate in 1871, and that at no time in his life was he worth more than from that amount to $3 million. He had recklessly parted with a great deal of his money, he stated. He testified also to having lost $600,000 in 2 years in fitting up the Metropolitan Hotel for one of his sons, and to having paid his lawyers $400,000 between 1872 and 1875. His escape from Ludlow Street Jail had cost him $60,000. It is reasonably certain that he had been blackmailed on all sides, and besides this, as has already been shown, he had been compelled to disgorge a vast share of the plunder to members of the legislature and others. When his troubles began, he transferred his real estate and, it is supposed, his money to his son, Richard M. Tweed. In Ludlow Street Jail he occupied the warden's parlor at a cost of $75 a week. As he lay dying, on April 12, 1878, he said to the matron's daughter, quote, "Mary, I have tried to do good to everybody, and if I have not, it is not my fault. I am ready to die, and I know God will receive me." Unquote. Wow. To his physician, Dr. Carnochan, he said, quote, "Doctor, I've tried to do some good, if I haven't had good luck. I am not afraid to die. I believe the guardian angels will protect me." Unquote. He sounds Romanist to me. The matron said he never missed reading his Bible. Which Bible? According to S. Foster Dewey, his private secretary, Tweed's last words were, quote, "I have tried to right some great wrongs. I have been forbearing with those who did not deserve it." What a proud man. Haughty thief. Right up to the end. "I forgive all those who have ever done evil to me, and I want all those whom I have harmed to forgive me." Unquote. So now you're demanding forgiveness. What a scumbag. Then, throwing out his hand to catch that of Luke, his black attendant, he breathed his last. Only 8 carriages followed the plain hearse carrying his remains, and the cortege attracted no attention. Quote, "If Tweed had died in 1870, unquote, said the cynical coroner Woltman, one of his former partisans, quote, "Broadway would have been festooned with black, and every military and civic organization in the city would have followed him to Greenwood." Unquote. Sweeney settled with the prosecutor for a few $100,000 and found a haven in Paris until years later he reappeared in New York. He lived to an old age. The case of the people against him was settled, as the aldermanic committee appointed in 1877 to investigate the ring frauds reported to the Common Council, quote, "in a very curious and somewhat incomprehensible way." Unquote. The suits were discontinued, on Sweeney agreeing to pay the city the sum of $400,000, quote, "from the estate of his deceased brother, James M. Sweeney." Unquote. What the motive was in adopting this form, the committee did not know. The committee styled Sweeney, quote, "the most despicable and dangerous of the ring, because the best educated and the most cunning of the entire gang." Unquote. Well, I'll conjecture there. It sounds like he was in a Romanist secret society, perhaps the ringleader of all Romanist secret societies. Sounds like it. That sounds like it to me. I don't know. Why else would they let the guy off with such leniency and say that he was the best educated and the most cunning? That sounds like somebody who might be in or affiliated with that military order of Rome. Continuing. Connolly fled abroad with $6 million and died there. Various lesser officials also fled, while a few contractors and officials who remained were tried and sent to prison, chiefly upon the testimony of Garvey, who turned state's evidence and then went to London. Under the name of A. Jeffreys Garvey, he lived there until his death in 1897. Of the three judges most involved, Barnard, Cardozo, and McCunn, the first and the last were impeached, while Cardozo resigned in time to save himself from impeachment. The question remains, how much did the ring steal? Henry F. Tainter, the auditor employed in the finance department by Andrew H. Green to investigate the controller's books, testified before the Special Aldermanic Committee in 1877 that he had estimated the frauds to which the city and county of New York had been subjected during the 3.5 years from 1868 to 1871 at from $45 million to $50 million. The Special Aldermanic Committee, however, evidently thought the thefts amounted to $60 million, for it asked Tweed whether they did not approximate that sum, upon which he gave no definite reply. But Mr. Tainter's estimate, as he himself admitted, was far from complete, even for the 3.5 years. It is the generally accepted opinion among those who have had the best opportunity for knowing that the sums distributed among the Ring and its allies and dependents amounted to over $100 million. Matthew J. O'Rourke, who, since his disclosures, made a further remarkable study of this special period, informed the author that, from 1869 to 1871, the Ring stole about $75 million, and that he thought the total stealings from about 1865 to 1871, counting vast issues of fraudulent bonds, amounted to $200 million. Of the entire sum stolen from the city, only $876,000 was recovered. The next question is, where did all this money go? We have referred to the share that remained to Tweed and Connolly, but the other members of the Great Ring and its subordinate rings kept their loot, a few of them returning to the city a small part by way of restitution. When Garvey died in London, his estate was valued at $600,000. Chapter 26. Tammany rises from the ashes. After the disclosures of 1871, the name of Tammany Hall became a byword throughout the civilized world, and the enemies of corruption assured themselves that the organization was shorn of political power for a long time to come. But the wonderful instinct of self-preservation which had always characterized Tammany, joined with the remarkable sagacity which its chiefs almost invariably displayed in critical times, now conspired to keep the organization alive despite every antagonistic influence. The Tammany Society still had its charter, and while that charter remained intact, Tammany retained strong potentialities for regaining power. The reformers neglected to ask for its annulment, though it is doubtful if they could have obtained it, since the governor, John T. Hoffman, was a creation of the Tammany organization. The urgent need of the wigwam was a leader. In response to the demand, two men, John Kelly and John Morrissey, stepped to the front. Both of them were the product of local politics, and having made a science of their experience, they knew that the Tammany Hall that now lay prostrate and reviled could be raised and again made a political factor, and eventually the ruler of the city. The few men of fair character in the organization were undesirous of appearing too prominently in its councils, but despite the general odium attached to it, Kelly and Morrissey found that a large part of the thoughtless mass of the Democratic voters were still willing to follow its leadership. Kelly had been in Europe from 1868 to late in 1871 and had not been directly implicated in the Tweed frauds. He had a strong personality and was popular among the largest and most energetic part of the voting population, the Irish. He was called Honest John Kelly, and he took care to strengthen the belief implied in that name, surrounding himself at all times with a glamour of political probity. Born April 20th, 1822, in New York City, of poor parents, his early life was divided between hard work and fighting, though he never appeared in the prize ring. His trade was that of a grate setter and mason. His early education was defective, but he later improved his natural talents by study at the parochial and evening schools. The district in which he lived was the roughest of the city. Being a man of aggressive ways and popular enough to control the turbulent elements, the politicians in 1853 had him elected an alderman, a post which he retained during 1854 and 1855. In this body, he was known as a quote-unquote bench warmer, that is, a member who kept his seat and followed the orders of his political masters without question. Giving satisfaction, he was selected to run for Congress in the district then represented by Mike Walsh, who was regarded in Washington as the leader of the rowdy element of New York City. Walsh ran independently, but Kelly beat him by 18 votes in a total vote of 7,598. It was generally charged then, and long after, that Kelly was quote-unquote counted in. Later he was re-elected. During his terms in Congress, Kelly controlled most of the federal patronage in New York City, and it was through his influence, especially, that Isaac V. Fowler, who, as we have mentioned, was afterward found to have embezzled over $155,000 from the government, was reappointed postmaster by Buchanan. In 1863, Kelly, disgruntled at not being appointed a police commissioner, led a portion of the Irish vote from the wigwam over to the Germans, helping in the election of Gunther as mayor. Having proved his influence, Tweed, in order to gain him over, gave him the nomination for sheriff, to which office he was elected. His nomination for mayor and his sudden withdrawal we have already related. At the time of his flight to Europe, he was a rich man. Mayor Havemeyer charged, in 1874, as we shall see, that some, at least, of Kelly's wealth was obtained by anything but proper methods. This was the successor of Tweed as the boss of Tammany Hall. His coadjutor for a time, John Morrissey, was a professional prize fighter and gambler, whose boast was that he, quote, had never fought foul nor turned a card, unquote. When these men assumed control of the wigwam, few persons believed it could outlive the Ring revelations and regain power. Then occurred an extraordinary happening, though quite in keeping with Tammany shrewdness. At the Society's annual election in April 1872, Kelly and Augustus Schell, parenthesis, who had been elected Grand Sachem after Tweed was forced to resign, end parenthesis, caused to be elected as sachems some of the identical men who had been most conspicuous in the reform movement, such as Samuel Tilden, Charles O'Connor, Horatio Seymour, Sanford Church, and August Belmont. The best proof that the non-partisan movement of 1871 was already dissolving was the readiness with which these men accepted these elections. Their acceptance may have been due to a mixed desire to make of the organization a real reform body, as well as to advance their political fortunes. The Tammany Society now stood before the public as a reform body, with the boast that all the thieves had been cast out. Next, it appointed a reorganization committee to reconstruct the Tammany Hall political organization. Under its direction, the General Committee was enlarged to nearly 500 members, and a new General Committee, of unquestionably better quality than its predecessor, was elected. In the case of disputing district delegations, the Tammany Society's committee decided by selecting the best men for both. Out of chaos, within a few months of the Ring's overthrow, Kelly created a strong organization, so deftly composed as to place itself before the people as an entirely distinct set of men from the Ring thieves, as a really democratic body, quite as heartily in favor of good government as the most exacting reformer. Kelly acted with great shrewdness, executive force, knowledge of men, and apparent regard for the public interests and proprieties. He affected extreme modesty and made it appear that the delegates chose nominees by their own uninfluenced will. At the Judiciary Convention in Tammany Hall in October 1872, he insisted that each delegate vote. In his speech, he said that Tammany should have no more of the times when tickets were made up outside of conventions. Some delegates shouting for the nomination of a man of dubious character, he declared, with the air of a man exerting himself for the good of his party only, that it was time that Tammany Hall should put such a ticket in the field that no man could hold up the finger of scorn at any individual on it. He furthermore caused the appointment of a committee to cooperate in the work of reform with the Bar Association, the Committee of 70, the Municipal Taxpayers Association, and the Liberal Republicans. At Kelly's suggestion, the Wigwam, in the fall of 1872, nominated for mayor Abraham Lawrence, a member of the Committee of 70 and its council, and for judges of the Supreme and Superior Courts, men of ability and unimpeachable name. Altogether, Tammany took on such a new guise that thousands of voters returned to its support. But the anti-Tammany movement had not yet dissipated its strength, even though it presented a divided front. One wing of this new opposition was the new Reform Organization, quote-unquote, the quote-unquote Apollo Hall Democracy, founded by James O'Brien, who now stood forth as its candidate for mayor. The other wing, composed of the individuals and associations centering about the Committee of 70, nominated William Havemeyer. Tammany had the advantage of a presidential year when the obligation of quote-unquote regularity could be imposed upon a goodly share of the Democratic voters, and the further advantage of a high order of personal character in its nominees. Nevertheless, Havemeyer won, the vote standing approximately Havemeyer 53,806, Lawrence 45,398, O'Brien 81,121. The results from several election districts were missing and were never canvassed by the Board of Canvassers. For Horace Greeley, the Democratic presidential candidate, Tammany Hall carried the city by 28,000 majority. Mayor Havemeyer's administration differed greatly from most of the quote-unquote reform administrations that had preceded it. Never since the year 1800 had the city revenue been distributed with such great care. The utmost regard was paid to the ordinances dealing with public health and security, and the streets were kept cleaner than ever before. The rowdy and criminal classes were deprived of the free sway they had so long enjoyed. The public school system was improved, and the standard of official character was of a higher type than had been known in many a decade. The city expenditures in 1873 were about $82 million, as compared with $36,262,589.41 in 1871. And notwithstanding the tremendous legacy of debt left by the Tweed Ring, to be shouldered by later administrations, Mayor Havemeyer's administration reduced the city expenses about $8 million in reality, though the bare figures on their face did not show that result. Mayor Havemeyer complained, as so many of his predecessors had done, of the perverse interference of the legislature in city affairs, an interference which constantly embarrassed his plans and set back the cause of reform. The mayor was not destined to serve his full term. In September 1874, a bitter quarrel sprang up between him on the one hand and John Kelly and John Morrissey on the other, apparently over the appointment, at Kelly's request, of Richard Croker to be a marshal. Wrote the mayor, quote, "When Croker's appointment was announced, I was overwhelmed with a torrent of indignation," unquote. In a public letter addressed to Kelly, Mayor Havemeyer charged that the former, while sheriff, had obtained $84,482 by fraudulent and illegal receipts, adding this further characterization, quote, "I think that you were worse than Tweed, except that he was a larger operator. The public knew that Tweed was a bold, reckless man, making no pretensions to purity. You, on the contrary, were always voting your honesty, and wrapped yourself in the mantle of piety. Men who go about with the prefix of honest to their names are often rogues," unquote. Kelly replied that he had... It's like in that movie Little Big Man, when Dustin Hoffman's character gets ripped off by Honest John Applebaum. You just know there's going to be a problem with a business partner named Honest John, right? Okay, continuing. Kelly replied that he had acted in the sheriff's office as had his predecessors and brought a libel suit against the mayor, in the answer to which the latter embodied his charges in full. But on the day the suit was to come to trial, Havemeyer fell dead of apoplexy in his office. Okay, well, something fishy going on there, huh? That reeks of foul play, but who knows, huh? During the 2 years, 1872 to 1874, various forces combined to restore Tammany to the old power. The two great parties were struggling for partisan advantage for future state and national elections. This brought about the old party alignment, the Reform Democrats, as a rule, acting with the Wigwam, and the Reform Republicans drifting to the Republican side. The disreputable classes issued forth in greater force than ever to help replace in power the Tammany that meant to them free sway. The Panic of 1873, with the consequent quote-unquote hard times, turned great bodies of voters against the dominant party. The Ring had so thoroughly looted the city that Havemeyer's administration was forced to practice economy in the public works. The working classes either did not understand the motive of this retrenchment or did not appreciate it. Out of the 24,500 mechanics in the city during the winter of 1873 to 74, 15,000, it was estimated, were employed. Tammany now adroitly declared itself in favor of giving public employment to the workers. The Wigwam agents scoured the poorer districts during the campaign of 1874, giving aid to the needy, and gained their support. The agitation against a third term for President Grant, the demand for a low tariff, and the denunciation of the Washington Ring all had their effect, while the impression which naturally might have been expected from Havemeyer's charges against Kelly was entirely lost by the former's slurring allusions to Kelly's humble birth and early occupation, allusions which threw the sympathy and support of the masses strongly to Kelly and his ticket. The astonishing consequence was that in November 1874, Tammany Hall, which in 1871 seemed buried beneath obloquy, elected its candidate for mayor, William H. Wickham, a diamond merchant and an anti-Ring Democrat and a member of the Committee of 70, by nearly 9,000 majority overall, his vote being 70,071 against 24,226 for Oswald Ottendorfer, the independent Democratic candidate, and 36,953 for Salem H. Wales, the Republican. At the same election, Tilden, who had also contributed to the downfall of the Ring, received the solid support of Tammany and was elected to the governorship. Tammany Hall, under the surface, was rapidly becoming its old self. Its candidate for register, Jim Hayes, had made, it was charged, $500,000 during the Tweed regime. Fully 3/4 of the office seekers in this election were connected with the liquor interests, and as many of these were keepers of low groggeries, they were in constant conflict with the law. 9 of the 15 Tammany candidates for alderman were former creatures or beneficiaries of the ring, one of them being under 2 indictments for, you guessed it, fraud. Yet the partisan currents at work again swept almost all of them into office. Well realizing the value of appearances, Kelly lectured the new members of the Common Council, telling them that, quote, there must be no bad measures, no rings, no getting together of a few men for the purpose of making money and controlling patronage, unquote. Yet Kelly himself at this time absolutely controlled the strongest and probably the most corrupt political organization in the Union. He dictated state, judicial, congressional, legislative, and municipal nominations at will, and continued to be the absolute boss until his death in 1886. Chapter 27. The Dictatorship of John Kelly, 1874 to 1886. The history of the Tammany Society and of Tammany Hall during the period from 1874 onward embraces a vast and intricate web of influences and activities and consequences. To present this period in the detail proportionate to that employed in the preceding chapters would require an amount of space inconsistent with the projected volume of this work. It will therefore be presented in the manner of a comprehensive summary in which the main movement will be outlined and a particular treatment given only to the more important features and events. Toward the end of 1874, Kelly's rule had become supreme. Under the form of quote-unquote requests, he assessed every office holder, even calling upon men receiving only $1,000 a year to pay as much as $250. To systematize these assessments, he established a regular collectorship in charge of the Society's Wiskinski, a city employee, drawing $1,500 a year for apparent services. Abundant charges, some of which were proved, were made as to corruption in many of the city departments. During the next year, 1875, a number of disaffected wigwam men formed the, quote, Irving Hall Democracy and issued an address denouncing the Tammany General Committee as the creature of the society. The effect of this defection and of the charges of public corruption were such that, in the local elections, Tammany lost many of the minor offices. The friendship between Kelly and Tilden had already been broken. Kelly organized a bitter opposition to Tilden at the St. Louis National Convention in 1876, but pledged himself to support the nominations and kept his word. The presidential campaign of this year held the municipal struggle within strict party lines. The various Democratic factions united on Smith Ely, electing him mayor by a majority of 58,517 over John A. Dix, the Republican candidate. From December 1876 to December 1880, Kelly filled the position of city controller and was credited with reducing the city debt. Politics, however, rather than fiscal administration for the benefit of the city, continued to be his main business. One of the numerous examples of his superior sagacity in bowing to the general public sentiment was his support in 1878 of Edward Cooper, an anti-Tammany nominee for mayor, a man of recognized independence of character who was elected. Tammany at this time was still largely influenced by the old Tweed conspirators, the assertion being made in 1877 that at least 50 former office holders under Tweed were to be found in the General Committee. In 1879 occurred the well-known fight of Tammany against the Democrats of the rest of the state. The Democratic State Convention had assembled at Syracuse. The roll call had barely begun when Augustus Schell, spokesman for the Tammany organization, stated that as there was every prospect that Governor Lucius Robinson would be renominated, the delegates from New York City would withdraw, although they stood ready to support any other name. This suggestion, as Schell afterwards called it, was unheeded, whereupon the entire Tammany delegation retired. The delegation meeting elsewhere, Kelly, with the specific object of defeating Robinson, caused himself to be nominated for governor. The quarrel between Robinson and the Tammany chief was personal, arising from the fact that the governor had removed Henry A. Gumbleton, a prominent Wigwam man, from the office of county clerk. Such was the discipline to which Kelly had reduced the organization that it obeyed his word without a single protest. He succeeded in his ulterior object. His 77,566 votes caused the defeat of Robinson, who received 875,790 votes, to 418,567 for Alonzo B. Cornell, the Republican candidate. The significant lesson furnished by Kelly's making good his threat was one generally heeded thereafter by state and national politicians and candidates who declined to invite the hostility of so great a power. But for this secession and the consequent demoralization of the Democratic Party in the state, New York's electoral vote, it is generally thought, would have gone to General Hancock in 1880. Mayor Cooper refused to reappoint Kelly to the office of Comptroller at the expiration of his term in December 1880 because of his supposed agency in the defeat of Hancock. In 1880, the Democrats of the city were divided into the factions of Tammany Hall and Irving Hall, but laying aside differences till after the election, they agreed upon an apportionment of the local offices. The Democratic candidate for mayor, William R. Grace, was selected by the Tammany Committee from a list of names submitted by Irving Hall. Many of the members of the latter organization, however, were prejudiced against Mr. Grace because of his Roman Catholic faith, fearing that in case of his election, the public school appropriations would be diverted to sectarian uses. Well, that's exactly what Rome was trying to accomplish. They sent over a bishop or Cardinal Satoli to do that. So Gus Myers, he wouldn't understand the nature of that argument, though, of that history. Even though he lived it at the time, he didn't pay attention. I don't think he paid attention to such things. Didn't take them seriously. But it's the teaching of the Romanist Church. Rome never changes. They want control of it all. Bow down to Rome, and then they're okay. But they're not going to stop until then. So yes, that's true. If at all possible, that money would have been diverted to sectarian uses. if they could do that. Continuing. They joined with the Republicans in support of William Dowd. The vote stood: Grace 101,760, Dowd 98,715. Yes, indeed, this was the exact period, the beginning of the period, when that agent, the Cardinal Satoli, was sent over to really to conquer our schools, to infiltrate our schools and take them over. And Charles Wilcox and numerous other sources, all suppressed. They all give you the newspaper headlines, the newspaper articles, date, period, city, paper, they're all there. It's all flushed down the memory hole, but those are real historical facts. Continuing. Mayor Grace's official power was considerably limited by the action of the legislature, which had made the tenure of office of executives of departments longer than his own, a law which, in effect, put the department heads in a position independent of the mayor. In frequent messages, Mayor Grace expressed himself, as had Mayor Havemeyer, pointedly, though vainly, on the evils of legislative interference with the local government. In December 1880, a new organization called the New York County Democracy was formed by Abram Hewitt and others to oppose both Tammany Hall and Irving Hall. This body soon had a large enrolled membership and was joined later by a number of Democrats who had unsuccessfully attempted to bring about reform in Tammany. To that end, they had made an effort at the Society's annual election in April 1881 to elect their candidates for sachems, when the ticket, headed by Kelly, won by an average majority of 50 in about 775 votes. The fact, or belief, that the result was secured through repeating and other unfair means caused a considerable defection from Tammany. In the State Convention of October 1881, the Tammany delegation was ruled out, and the county democracy was declared, quote-unquote, regular. At an earlier period, this adverse decision might have entailed serious, if not fatal, consequences to the wigwam. But now that the organization was in a state of absolute discipline, ruled by one hard-headed, tireless boss, with each member understanding that his self-interest required his, quote-unquote, standing by the organization in times of trouble, as well as in times of triumph, the blow had no lasting effect. Holding the balance of power in the legislature of 1882, the Tammany members resolved to force the quote-unquote regular democracy to make terms with them. To that end, they attended no party caucuses and refused to support men nominated by the regular Democrats. At Kelly's order, they demanded, as the price of their cooperation, certain chairmanships of important committees. Not getting them, they continued for weeks their stubborn opposition. Finally, the two houses were organized, the Tammany men voting for the Republican candidate for clerk. Charges were freely made of a political bargain between Kelly and Governor Cornell. There were three Democratic factions in the city in 1882: Tammany Hall, Irving Hall, and the County Democracy. A movement to obtain non-partisan government caused the independent nomination of Allen Campbell for mayor. The Republicans endorsed him, but their support was greatly weakened by their nomination of a spoils politician, John J. O'Brien, for county clerk. the three Democratic factions agreed on Franklin Edson, who was elected by a majority of 21,417, the vote being Edson, 97,802, Campbell, 76,385. In the Chicago National Convention of 1884, the Tammany delegation bitterly opposed the nomination of Grover Cleveland, its orators virulently assailing his private and public character, though professing afterward to support him as the Democratic candidate. The Wigwam refused to unite with other Democratic organizations in any political demonstration. The reason seems to have been Mr. Cleveland's publicly expressed independence of Kelly and his machine. After the ensuing election, Tammany was generally charged with treachery. The Wigwam nominated a separate city and county ticket, naming Hugh J. Grant for mayor. The county Democracy and Irving Hall agreed upon the nomination of former Mayor William R. Grace and elected him with the rest of the Fusion ticket, the vote being Grace, 96,288, Grant, 86,361, Frederick S. Gibbs, Republican, 45,386. In these years, the control of the city offices was frequently divided among the various parties and factions. In the Board of Aldermen, as in the departments, were Tammany and county Democracy men and Republicans, so that no faction or party completely swayed the city. Much of their former power had been restored to the aldermen by the Charter Amendments of 1878, by the State Constitution of 1874, and various legislative acts. Reports arose from time to time that money was used to secure confirmation of appointments by the aldermen, but the nearest approach to detail was the testimony of Patrick H. McCann before the Facet Committee in 1890. Mr. McCann testified that Richard Croker, a brother-in-law, came to his store in 1884 with a bag containing $180,000, which, he said, was to be used in obtaining aldermanic votes to secure the confirmation, in case of his appointment, of Hugh Grant as Public Works Commissioner, and that he, Mr. Croker, was to get 10 cents a barrel on all cement used by that department. Mr. McCann further testified that Mr. Croker had told him that $80,000 of this sum was furnished by Mr. Grant, and the remainder by the organization. Mr. Croker, according to the same testimony, opened negotiations through Thomas Adams for the purchase of 2 Republican aldermen, whose votes were needed. The alleged deal, however, was not consummated, and the money was returned. Mr. Croker and Mr. Grant both swore that these statements were untrue. I bet they did. But the extraordinary corruption of the Board of Aldermen of 1884 is a matter of public record. 21 members, the exceptions among those present and voting being Alderman Grant and O'Connor, 21 members voted to give the franchise for a surface railway on Broadway to the Broadway Surface Railroad Company. The rival road, the Broadway Railroad Company, sought to bribe the aldermen with $750,000, half cash and half bonds, but the aldermen thought the bonds might be traced and considered it wiser to accept the $500,000 cash offered by the former, each alderman receiving $22,000. Mayor Edson vetoed the resolution, but it was repassed. Other street railway franchises were passed by the same board. Mr. McCann testified in 1890 that Mr. Grant had told him that Mr. Croker strongly advised him, Grant, not to have anything to do with, quote, that Broadway matter, unquote, as, quote, the other aldermen would be caught, unquote. Mr. Grant denied having said so. The fact remains that Mr. Grant was the only Tammany alderman free of suspicion. Many of the accused Tammany City Fathers were members of the organization's executive committee, which was composed almost exclusively of leaders and which was supposed to direct the wigwam's affairs. One alderman, Henry W. Johnny, was sentenced to penal servitude at hard labor for the term of 9 years and 10 months, and another, Honest John O'Neill, watch out for those guys who call themselves honest, sentenced to 4.5 years and to pay a fine of $2,000. A third, Arthur McQuaid, was sentenced to 7 years and ordered to return $5,000 of the bribed money to the city, but on July 20th, 1889, at a new trial at Ballston, he was acquitted. 6 other aldermen fled to Canada, and 3 turned state's evidence. 10 others were indicted, but were never brought to trial. As Colonel John R. Fellows, the district attorney who tried the cases, stated to the Fawcett Committee, convictions could not then be secured in 1890 because public sentiment had changed. The storm had subsided, people had grown tired of the subject, and many former opponents of the franchise had come to look upon it as a benefit. But there were strong hints that political influence had saved many persons from prison. Though the facts did not come out until the trials in 1886, public indignation and suspicion were so strong in 1884 that Kelly insisted that the Tammany aldermen who had voted for the franchise should not be renominated. Kelly broke down with nervous and physical prostration after the presidential campaign of 1884, Grover Cleveland's election, which falsified his predictions, deeply disappointed him. He kept to his house, number 34 East 69th Street, but still issued his orders to the Tammany organization. Towards the end, he could not sleep except by the use of opiates. He died on June 1st, 1886. Thus passed away the second absolute boss of Tammany Hall. For more than 10 years, 50,000 voters obeyed his commands. And it was he, and not the people, to whom a host of office holders, contractors, and all who profited directly or indirectly from politics, looked as their source of their appointment, employment, or emolument. On more than one occasion, Kelly complained of his onerous duty of providing government for New York City. The secret of his control was the same as that of Tweed and of the previous cliques. He knew that a large part of the voting mass cared nothing for good government, but looked upon politics solely as a means of livelihood. That another large part were satisfied to vote the quote-unquote regular ticket under any and all circumstances, and, with a keen understanding of human nature, he knew how to harmonize conflicting interests, to allay personal differences, and to soothe with large promises of future rewards his disaffected followers. Profiting by Tweed's fate, he knew the value of moderation, and he earned the praise not only of his interested followers, but also of a tolerant and easy-going class in the community, through the fact that, under his rule, the stealing, compared to that of the Tweed regime, was kept at a comparatively respectable minimum. It was pointed out to his credit that the fortune he left, reputed to be $500,000, was very reasonable for one who so long held real control of a great city. Okay, folks, that concludes this installment of The History of Tammany Hall by Gustavus Myers. This expose into the political machine that ran New York City, and I don't know, probably still does. But every city, every big city, every metropolis in America has these political machines. Certainly Chicago does. And the election isn't worth crap. Your vote's not worth crap. Stop wasting your time. Okay, you've been listening to Rejected Knowledge.